I was working as a park ranger in Green Mountain National Forest in Vermont. It was one of my childhood dreams to live in the forest and protect nature. I was a pretty idealistic kid. When I was little, I used to love the Smokey the Bear commercials on TV. They were my favorite, and he was my hero for some reason. So I was living my dream. I really loved it all. I spent a lot of my time just patrolling the trails and making sure everything was in good order. And there was a surprising amount of search and rescue missions, too. I was amazed at how unprepared some people were when they decided to spend time in the woods. I did plenty of brush clearing and removing fallen trees. That's how I ended up in this situation. I was almost done with my patrol one evening when I spotted a tree that seemed to be halfway sawn through. Whoever had been camping there apparently thought it was okay to cut down whole trees. I couldn't believe it, and how they chose that one to cut was beyond me. It was in a really awkward place on the side of the hill with a ton of brush under it. It looked really precarious, like it could fall at any time. I was walking back to the ATV to get my chainsaw. Then across the road through the trees, I saw what looked to be large saplings stacked together in kind of a teepee shape. There were two of those structures that I could see through the woods, and it was just really irritating me to think that these campers felt free to take down those young trees. I got my chainsaw out of the ATV and went back to do my cutting. When I got back to the tree, I saw that it wasn't a saw that had been used on it. It looked like something had pushed it until it started to splinter, which didn't seem possible. Unless you used like a heavy-duty truck or something. But a truck couldn't reach that spot. I was ready to take it down when I heard a tree limb snap. Before I could even turn around, I was pinned under this huge branch. It had landed across my thighs and one of my arms. I was pinned down there with the rest of the tree threatening to fall any minute. It was freaking unbelievable. I was so grateful that I was able to reach my radio and call in for help. I was trapped, but I wasn't in terrible pain. I could wiggle my fingers and it didn't feel like anything was broken. It had grazed my head on the way down, though, so I was bleeding. I felt like a real fool for getting myself in that position. It was starting to get dark, and I was getting really uncomfortable. I lay there for close to an hour before the rescue truck got to me. It wasn't hard for two people to get the branch off me. I was able to move everything fine, and I didn't feel too bad considering. I felt okay to walk, even though I was pretty stiff and limping a little. It was protocol that I be taken in for observation, though. There was no major hospital close by, but there was this old rural clinic in the area, so that's where they took me. It was dark by then, but I remember the moon was almost full because everything was still pretty visible. When we got there, the place looked more like an old house than anything. We were surprised to see a big military truck parked out in front. You know the kind you see in a convoy on the highway? There were soldiers doing something in the back. We went up a ramp to the entrance, but we were confronted by a guard in a combat uniform holding some kind of rifle. He told us there was no access through there. We explained my situation, but he said we would have to go to one of the outbuildings and he would let someone know we were there. We turned around to go back down the ramp. Then all of a sudden there was a bunch of shouting coming from the soldiers by the truck. They're shouting, "Clamp it down tighter, don't let it go." And they're obviously struggling with something inside of the truck. And then I heard the loudest, wildest yelp come out of the back of the truck. Primal, like a primal kind of scream. I limped down to the end of the ramp and was hit by this really horrible stench. The yelping went on, and I just felt heartsick for whatever it was, but also terrified. Me and the guys with me just stood there. We felt paralyzed by this bizarre situation. Then the front door of the clinic bursts open, and someone in a white coat came flying down the ramp holding something in one hand. The guard at the door yelled at us to get out of there and go to the other building. We were heading away, but we kept looking behind us, and the white coat guy was being helped up to reach in the truck, and then in a couple minutes everything got quiet. We reached the door of the outbuilding and just stood there watching. They were letting down the tailgate, and then all of them together pulled out what looked like a giant stretcher. Something huge was under a sheet, but when they were jostling it down, something like a big hairy foot got uncovered. I couldn't tell the color, but it was huge and it was hairy. but the toes looked almost human. The guard opened the entrance door and they carried it inside. That's all I know. There's nothing about that night that I can explain. A lot of my extended family live in the Atchafalaya Basin. Far back as we can figure, they've been shrimping, crabbing, and crawfishing these parts, and I loved helping when I visited. I would also get to live on a houseboat that got power from a generator when visiting. Ever since I can remember, I've been hearing stories about the loup-garou. I think it's the same thing other people call dogman. The loup-garou mostly goes after kids who are bad, so I always thought it was just a story people made up to keep kids in line. Now I'm not so sure about that. See, my brother Jim and I got a shrimp boat, and we go out from before the sun rises until after the sun sets during brown shrimp season. You gotta get them during those few weeks because after that, they're gone for the year. The rest of the year we can get crabs and crawfish, but we make most of our money from the shrimp. It's a lot of work tossing that net out of the boat, hauling it back in, and getting the shrimp out of it. I don't pay a lot of attention to what's out there in the swamp, but every once in a while, late at night, we'll hear a howl and Jim will say, "That's the loup-garou." I never believe him, but I also can't explain the noise because it doesn't sound like a dog or wolf or coyote. I never thought about it too much until we started bringing Timmy along. Timmy is Jim's kid. He's 11, but he caught on quick to sorting out the shrimp we keep from all the other stuff that gets caught in the net, turtles, fish, whatever. I heard the howl more often when Timmy started joining us. Jim stopped saying, "That's the loup-garou," probably so he wouldn't scare the kid. Maybe that made me even notice it more. I started ignoring it because we were hearing that howl every night. It sounds weirdly human. It was creepy, but I guess I got used to it. Besides, we were busy, like I said, hauling in the nets. One late afternoon, though, we passed by a small piece of marshy land, and I saw something standing on it, like near the water. I thought it was a person, but it had weird, curved legs. Then it threw back its head. First, I noticed the long, dog-like snout. Then I heard that howl. Jim was driving the boat, and he must have heard it over the engine because he turned in the other direction as fast as he could, which wasn't that fast. I had plenty of time to see the thing lower its head and stare at us with its red, demonic eyes. I felt like it was looking at Timmy. He behind me. I hoped he didn't notice the thing, but I guess he did because he looked scared too. We were headed toward another shrimping spot, and when we got there, we all started working like nothing happened. Jim took a different route back when we finished for the night. We wouldn't never pass by that spot again if we could help it. But then, on the way back, I saw it again. Its fur looked all silver in the full moon. I didn't even think about there being a full moon right then. It almost looked like the moon was a spotlight trained on it. I could see everything. Big muscles under thick fur, pointy dog-like ears. I'm pretty sure it was taller than a person too, maybe 8 feet high judging by the trees near it. So that was scary enough, but then it showed its teeth. They glinted like swords in the moonlight. They were huge. I could imagine the hole they'd make in a person. Jim turned the boat again, but just as he did, the thing leaped into the air and sailed toward us. It was a long jump, maybe 10 feet. I thought there was no way it'd make it to our boat. You can guess I wouldn't be telling this if it didn't make it. It did, just barely. It slammed into the side of the boat with its front legs gripping the side and back legs dangling below. I stood there frozen, watching it try to scramble up. I think my brain just wouldn't process what was going on. But I finally cottoned onto that if I didn't move quick, the thing would be up on the deck attacking us. Besides, I was pretty sure it was after Timmy. I had to stop it from getting him. I ran over to the deck and started kicking at its front legs. It snarled at me and pulled its head up, trying to bite my feet. All this time, Jim was driving the boat as fast as it would go, which really isn't that fast. Plus, he had to watch out not to ground the boat. In this marsh, land can kind of sneak up on you. Even though we weren't going that fast, though, that thing must have been real strong to hang on while we were moving. I had on thick rubber shrimp boots, but one of those teeth caught and made a hole in it. Later on, when I doubted what really happened, I looked at the hole in those boots and I knew it was real. After it made the hole, I used the bottom of the boot to kick harder, right into its face. It tried to bite the boot again, but the bottom was too hard. It couldn't get a grip. I managed to pull my foot back and kick again. This time I must have somehow gotten in exactly the right spot because it fell back into the water. I didn't see it come back up, but I think it probably did. I reckon at some point I'll see it again. I got a feeling it's not gone forever. I've always been a loner. It's probably mostly out of habit, as I had a lot of illnesses as a kid, so I never really got to have a normal childhood with friends and stuff. Instead, I spent a lot of time in a hospital bed and a lot more time dreaming about being part of a group like the characters from my favorite TV shows. I started getting better as I got older. By my late teens, I barely had any major hospital stays. But I was still homeschooled because my parents and doctors didn't want to put too much stress on my immune system right away. Maybe that's why I really wanted to go to college. Not just online, I wanted the whole thing. Doom rooms, cafeteria food, walking to class, all of it. I guess I wanted to make up for lost time. When I first started, I was really nervous. I didn't really know how to interact with people who weren't wearing scrubs except for what I'd learned from watching TV. Turns out I didn't have to worry so much. I met a super nice group: James, Rosalie, Sarah, and Joe. We shared some interests, and they were really cool despite my awkwardness. I really wanted to make a good impression on them so that I could become an official member of the friend group. I was hoping for an opportunity to do some sort of group activity so I could bond with everyone. I got my chance when they invited me on a camping trip. We would all carpool to the campsite, which wasn't too far away. Then we would spend a long weekend hanging out and sleeping under the stars. When we got to the campsite, they taught me how to set up the tents and cook camping food. We roasted marshmallows and sang campfire songs and stargazed and told scary stories. It was just like on TV, only better, because it was real. Unfortunately, not all the evening was great. There were other groups camping in the sites around us, and one of them was really rude. I don't know what school they went to, but they were college kids like us. They partied very loudly through half of the night. James went over to talk to them, then Sarah. It wasn't just us either. A few of the other groups camping in the area tried to talk to them. They wouldn't listen. It wasn't a huge deal in the grand scheme of things, but we were all annoyed that they were being so inconsiderate. So we decided to teach them a little lesson. When we were telling scary stories the first night, we found out that Joe could do some disturbingly convincing, creepy monster noises. We decided to use that to freak out the rude campers by making them think there was a real monster. Joe went into the car so nobody nearby would hear and recorded several audio clips of various monster noises. He connected his phone to Sarah's Bluetooth speaker, which we then hid near the other campsite. Then we found a hiding place further away where we could see the results of our prank without them seeing us. Joe started playing the clips, and it was so funny. He started with a low growl noise. The rude campers were playing music, and they stopped and turned it down so they could hear better. Then Joe pressed play again, and they looked at each other all nervous. We all had to bite our hands to keep quiet. We could hear the rude campers asking each other if they heard a sound. Joe kept them on edge with some ominous hissing and growling sounds for a couple minutes. Finally, Rosalie grabbed the phone, turned the volume way up, and blasted them with a screeching roar. They all went ballistic. Everyone ran around screaming, grabbing their stuff, and running into their trailer. My friends and I were all laughing so hard as we ran away. We were walking along this kind of hill area, where the ground sort of dropped off with a moderate slope. At the bottom of the hill, it got flat again, and the trees resumed. From where we were, we could see out over the lower area and into the trees. There was a denser patch of trees between us and the rude campers, so we felt comfortable having our flashlights on. We were all whispering and giggling about the prank we just pulled, and we were generally in very high spirits. But then James made a gesture which made his flashlight beam shine into the forest at the base of the slope. I just remember a flash of red eyes and a large, dark shape. We all froze, except Joe. I guess he was more adventurous, or maybe he just didn't believe he'd seen what he'd seen. He slowly moved his light back to where we saw the shape. I'd be willing to bet that everyone else was thinking exactly what I was thinking, that Joe had just gotten all of us killed. Because there was something there. I saw a dark, hulking body, definitely not human-shaped. The shoulders were too broad and looked misshapen. It didn't seem to have much of a head either, just a lump on its shoulders with those huge red eyes. We didn't move. It didn't move. It just stared straight at us. Suddenly, part of what I thought were misshapen shoulders shot out sideways. They were huge wings, way bigger than even the biggest birds. And I guess they weren't for show, because whatever the thing was crouched down and then shot straight up into the air like it was launched from a cannon. We all looked up, but somehow it had already disappeared into the night sky. I don't think any of us slept the rest of that night. I don't know about the others, but I was waiting for the thing from the forest to come back. I didn't know what I thought it would do, but I didn't want to find out. But whatever it was, it never came back. As soon as it was light, we packed up and went back to school, and we all agreed never to talk about what had happened again. I had hoped that my first camping trip with my new friends would be an experience to remember, but I hadn't counted on living through a real-life episode of Scooby-Doo. Maybe the hospital was safer after all. Years ago, when I was only 20, I did the stupidest thing ever. I was driving back to my college in Massachusetts and had left later in the evening, right around sunset. It was about a 2-hour drive, and at the time my radio wasn't working, so I was dreading the quiet ride back. I had been driving for no longer than 20 minutes when I saw a lady on the side of the road nearly get run over by the car in front of me. Something told me to stop and see if she needed help. I pulled over and got out, approaching her slowly. I asked her if everything was all right and if she needed a ride somewhere. She nodded before she got into the passenger side. In a sense, I was glad to have company on the drive so I wouldn't be bored out of my mind. I glanced around before getting into my car and driving off. We made small talk, and along the way she started to open up and conversate with me. Right away I noticed she had some type of accent, like she wasn't from the area. In the midst of picking her up in the dark, I didn't realize the clothes she had on. It seemed like an undergarment dress like people back in the days wore. I commented on it in a joking manner and said, "You must work somewhere you have to dress up like old times, huh?" She gave me a puzzled look before turning her eyes back to the road. I shrugged it off, thinking she may have just been tired or didn't want to crack a joke with a stranger. I pointed to my radio and apologized for it being broken since we couldn't listen to music. I saw her out of the corner of my eyes mouthing something, and the radio miraculously turned on. I gasped excitedly, "Wow, thanks you got it to work." She frowned and tilted her head and said, "This thing is a radio, you said?" I nodded, and she inspected it further, like it was the first time she ever saw one. "You've never seen one before, have you?" I asked. She shook her head and stated, "I've only heard music played at church." Based on her clothes and her story, I started to suspect maybe she was Amish, since I know they do things the olden way. "Well, have at it. You can use this dial to search different stations for music." I instructed her how to do so, and for some reason all we got was static. "Sorry about that, I guess it's still broken," I said. Down the road I could see light from a distance, and as we approached it grew clearer. A man with a torch lit up was standing in the middle of the road. I thought to myself, what in the world is this guy doing that's dangerous? I slowed down and stopped the car a good 100 feet in front of him. I looked at the lady and her face turned pale white. It went without saying this had to be the guy she was running from. My eyes stayed locked on him, and I whispered to her, "I'll quickly drive around and pass him, but it could get bumpy." She took a deep breath and sighed. "No, it's okay, I need to face this," she said. She got out of the car and walked towards him. I rolled my window down just enough so I could hear them. All of a sudden, I hear her blurt out, "I've done nothing wrong. Thou hast no reason to suspect thy as a witch." She flung her arms in the air, yelling with all her might. The stern man blurted back, "Thine has practiced the art, and witnesses hath not denied. You will be burned at the stake, witch." I slumped in my seat and wanted to peel off, but I couldn't just leave her there. So much was going through my mind. Was she in fact Amish? And why is he throwing around the term witch? I was too busy paying attention to them to notice the mob of men with torches walking from behind my car. By the time I noticed them, it was far too late to drive off without running any of them over. So instead, I ran to the lady's side. Confused about their exchange, but certain of the danger, I took her hand and ran into the forest. It was like my flight or fight kicked in, and we both ran for what seemed like a good 10 minutes. We both ducked behind a sturdy tree and looked to see if they followed. We didn't hear or see anything, so we caught our breaths. She could tell by the look on my face I knew something about this whole thing was off. "If I told you I was a witch, would you fear me?" she asked. I paused, still trying to catch my breath. "You haven't shown me you're a threat, so no," I responded. "If you're a witch, it's safe to say you're not from these times, are you?" I asked. She grew quiet and nodded. "I'm not living nor dead. Salem was once my home, but it was all taken from me," she said. She went on to say how she was a witch, but not evil. The man we saw on the road was who she was set to marry, but she refused his hand in marriage. Out of spite, he spread false news of her malicious intentions when she had none. I could hear the pain in her voice as she welled up. She told me the worst part of it all was that she secretly had a child with a man she truly loved. She wasn't able to get any closure on his whereabouts or what came of them. I expressed my condolences and asked her name. She told me it was Elizabeth Stanton, and her lover's name was Randolph Locklear. I chuckled. What a coincidence my last name is Locklear. My smile faded, and we locked eyes. She leaned in closer, examining my face. Yes, of course your features are distinct," she said, turning my chin. "My descendant," she cried out happily before vanishing into thin air. I gasped, falling back. Had I really just seen that? I made my way back to my car, which was still sitting in the middle of the road. There was no sign of anyone, so I sat back in my car. I was still trying to process everything that happened. I was trying to snap out of it, so I turned the radio on. It caught onto a channel and started playing music. When I returned to my college a few hours later, I attempted to search for her and her lover's name, but I couldn't find anything. To this day, I haven't told anyone, but I believe Elizabeth really is my ancestor. It was like we were connected in those final moments, and I think she's at peace now. I was a fur trapper who used to trap in the Arctic around 40 years ago. There are very strange things happening in the Arctic. Maybe that's because it's so hard to get to and so cold. I spent over 10 years collecting fur in the Arctic, and here are just some of the strangest things I saw in my time there. A polar bear cut in half, in the middle of a snowy plain. We weren't close to the ocean, so no walrus or anything that could potentially saw a polar bear in half could have done it. The bear had no organs, but everything else was intact. The thing that had killed the polar bear only ate its internal organs and left. Over the next 10 years, I found around 7 more polar bear carcasses split in half just like the first. I swear the Arctic has its own ghosts, or some sort of shadow people. Often at night, me and a few other guys consisting of researchers and other trappers that were staying at the camp, I was reported back hearing sounds of people singing in an unknown language, faint drums, and children's laughter. When I finally asked the cook who had been working up in the Arctic longer than, he smirked at me and said, "You people couldn't understand." I would also find my things misplaced often. I am by no means a forgetful person. To be a fur trapper, you must be aware of where you put things, like your very sharp blades and dangerous traps, lest you end up maiming yourself. I also was 100% confident it wasn't my age causing me to forget where I kept my things, because I would find my misplaced items in places where I would never, ever keep them. One time, my toothbrush was in my pillowcase. Another, I found my favorite pair of socks 2 miles away from my camp. I chalked it up to some animal that wasn't as afraid of humans as it should be, but the lack of animal evidence, bite marks, fur, saliva. One year, while watching the northern lights, I saw an aircraft in the far distance descend until they were around 50 feet above the snowy dunes. The small plane dropped a few very large wooden boxes and swiftly took off. I thought about what I had seen all night that night, and in the morning I set out to quench my curiosity. It had seemed whatever was in those boxes was alive, because there was an insane amount of fresh blood in the snow surrounding the boxes. It had seemed that the carnivores of the Arctic had beat me, because there wasn't anything left to see except wooden splinters and chunks of flesh. I did, however, see one large chunk of flesh the size of my torso with shimmering green scales on it. During my 5th year, my buddy Ray caught something real strange while fishing. It had 7 eyes. They looked a little too human-like for my taste, that it used to stare at us balefully. In its stomach, we found an entire human hand. The researchers Ray and I brought it up to seemed perplexed. I genuinely doubt those nerds knew anything about it. I would often catch small cryptid creatures in my traps. They looked like tiny babies, except with huge heads with beady black eyes that suggested animal-like intelligence. They were also pale to the point of being gray or sometimes even blue. The first time I came across one, I was beside myself with fear. I was convinced aliens were going to take over the planet in the following day, but it never happened. The other guys at camp reassured me that those things are normal and have been showing up ever since 1945, ever since the United States bombed Japan. It took me a while, but I eventually accepted those things were harmless and just started letting them go. They would always stare at me reproachfully as I undid my traps and then slowly crawl out of the trap and back into the snow. I have a little more time before my break, so I'll type out one more weird occurrence I had while in the Arctic. There's an urban legend at my camp about a guy who wanders the Arctic plains wearing a suit and nothing else. We call him the businessman. It's said that if you came across him while on a night hunt, he will try to strike a deal with you. It's best to agree to strike a deal, but you can negotiate all you want. Just make sure you say yes to that deal. I luckily never had to encounter the businessman, but a few of my buddies over the years swore up and down they had. Between you and me, sometime in my 7th or 8th year, I was laying out traps and scoping the landscape late one night. I was laying on the top of a snow dune and peering out at one of my traps with a pair of binoculars. My focus trailed to the mountain range in the distance, and walking oh so far away, probably around 5 or 6 miles across the snowy plains, was a singular man's silhouette, his pantsuit ripping around his legs ferociously in the wind. Needless to say, I am not one for messing around, and I got the hell out of there. Also, I had just bagged some really nice fox fur earlier on this particular venture, and I didn't feel like trading it for whatever nonsense the businessman had for me. I spent the best years of my life fur trapping in the Arctic. They were also the scariest years of my life, too. When I was in college, a couple of us got really deep into urban exploration. I was studying photography, and any excuse to grab crazy pictures was welcome. Thankfully, Detroit offered all kinds of opportunities. My friend Jamie said her boyfriend had been in and around some places over in Brush Park, and maybe we should check it out. I'm all for an adventure, but there are some neighborhoods famous for being dangerous, and Brush Park is pretty much top of the list. I wanted to take some pictures, not get held up. Regardless, when Jamie's boyfriend showed me some of the pictures on his cell phone, I was ready to take the risk. Even with the low resolution, there was clearly lots of amazing stuff to capture. To give you an idea, Brush Park covers around 20 blocks and has streets lined with these big, rambling old German-style houses. Gables, archways, pillars, the works. Picture all that side by side with construction projects, and the juxtaposition is wild. We target a couple of blocks right over by where they tore down the Douglas projects as a key place to try and get into some houses. Any urban explorer will tell you that nighttime is when you're less likely to get rounded up. But the photographer in me knows that late afternoon into evening is best for the light. We compromised and headed over right around dusk on a Saturday. We parked at the end of the block and started walking, looking for an ideal fit. I loved places that were pretty ruined, but were still navigable. I wasn't looking to fall through any floorboards or anything. This one house seemed perfect. It was huge. The roof over the porch was sagging and some of the windows had been broken out. I snapped some pictures from the outside, and we went around back to find an inconspicuous place to climb in. The doors were still bolted, but a window into the kitchen looked like a good option. As soon as I hoisted up to the sill, something seemed off. There was that cool, mildewy, dusty funk that hangs in ruined houses, but just a hint of something else. I got in, and Tom and Jamie followed. Jamie immediately got creeped out and said she wanted to go. Part of me felt the same way, but this place was amazing. The door out of the kitchen opened onto a hallway that made my stomach all squirmy. Evidently, Tom didn't feel any of it because he went right past me and started barging around like an idiot. There was a door in the wall by the staircase that stuck when he tried the knob. That would have been enough for me, but he got all heroic about it and yanked the door open. It sounds crazy, but I'm not kidding when I say that when he did, it sounded like the house exhaled through the door. He got all excited and broke out his flashlight. I came up over his shoulder to look, and it was the door to the basement. The stairs looked sturdy enough, but it was 7 kinds of dark down there. My stomach was going crazy telling me to get out, but Tom just smiled and went tromping ahead. Jamie stayed in the kitchen, but I sucked it up and followed into the basement. It was creepy as hell and completely amazing. I must have snapped 1,000 pictures before I made it 10 feet. The place was packed with all kinds of junk. My instinct was always to find the tightest crevices, so I shoved my way toward the far end where the trash seemed to be the thickest. My hands were clammy and my heart felt like it was in my throat, but I couldn't figure out why. Just before I reached the far corner, something shifted and held my breath. It was so dark, and I lifted my camera to see if the viewfinder could help me see. That little yellow box that frames faces was bobbing around in the middle of the screen, which was super weird because there was nobody there. Then 2 pinpoints of light flicked on. I forget whether or not I made a sound, but Tom got all tense and asked what was up. Before I could say anything, a whole mass of junk crashed to the side, and this thing crawled out on all 4s. It was pale to the point of being gray and moved in kind of a slither. The back legs had those backward joints like a dog, but the front had long, dirty fingers. Its head kept twisting back and forth, tipping up like it was smelling me. I pointed my camera and clicked the shutter, and a flash lit the whole area up. The thing hunched back, startled, and let out this horrible hissing moan sound. I screamed, and it lunged at me. Trying to get out of the way, I stumbled back and bumped into Tom, dropping my camera. I could hear Jamie screaming, "What's wrong?" from up in the kitchen, and knew we had to get out of there. The thing lunged again, and I panicked and ran. We both bolted up the stairs and back down into the kitchen. I don't know if the thing was behind us or not, but I just kept saying, we have to go, over and over again. We scrambled back out the window and ran for the car as fast as we could. I'm not sure exactly what it was we saw back there, but it definitely wasn't human. I lost